The words fell into the silence of the penthouse like a blade dropped on marble. Nyla froze, her back against the cold glass window, 40 floors above Seoul's glittering skyline, the man before her radiating danger she could taste on her tongue. He had found her in the one place she thought was safe. His eyes, dark and unreadable, moved over her like he already owned every inch of her. She should have run. Instead, something impossible stirred low in her chest, fear tangled with a heat she couldn't name. This was the night her life split into before and after. Welcome to Afro Soul Stories. Please like, share, and subscribe. 3 weeks earlier, Nyla had arrived in Seoul with nothing but a suitcase, a temporary work visa, and a stubborn refusal to be intimidated by a city that swallowed strangers whole. She'd taken a job as a translator for a shipping company near the harbor district, a job that paid enough to keep her small apartment and send money home to her mother in Lagos. She kept her head down. She didn't ask questions about the black cars that idled outside the company's warehouses at midnight, or why her supervisor flinched whenever a certain name was mentioned. That name was Choi Tae-yoon. She heard it first in whispers. Men lowered their voices. Women glanced toward the door before saying it. He was spoken of the way people speak of weather systems, something to be watched, respected, and feared, never confronted. She met him by accident. It happened on a Tuesday, rain slicing sideways through Seoul's narrow alleys. Nyla had stayed late reviewing shipping manifests when she noticed a discrepancy, crates logged as textiles that weighed far too much to be fabric. She should have said nothing. She said something anyway, cornering her supervisor with the papers in her hand, demanding an explanation he clearly didn't want to give. That was when the door opened. He walked in without announcement, dressed in black, rain still clinging to his shoulders, and the entire room changed temperature. Her supervisor stood so fast his chair toppled. Tae-yoon didn't look at him. His eyes went straight to Nyla, to the papers clutched in her hand, to the fire still burning in her expression even though every instinct in the room told her to lower her gaze. She didn't lower it. Who let her see the manifests? His voice was quiet. Quiet was somehow worse than shouting. She found them herself, sir. I'll handle it. He crossed the room slowly, and Nyla's pulse climbed with every step. I'll handle it. Up close, he was worse than the rumors, sharp jaw, a scar barely visible near his temple, eyes that catalogued her like he was deciding what she was worth. She refused to shrink. If these numbers are wrong, someone should answer for it, she said, chin lifted despite the tremor in her hands. Something flickered across his face. Not anger. Amusement, buried deep like he hadn't expected defiance from a woman standing in the wreckage of a conversation she wasn't supposed to overhear. Not afraid of me, he said. It wasn't a question. Should I be? Everyone else is. I'm not everyone else. He studied her a moment longer, then turned to her supervisor. Fire her! Nyla's stomach dropped. Actually, he added, already walking toward the door, don't. Give her a raise and find out where those crates are actually going. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at her one last time. Careful little translator. Curiosity in this city gets people killed. Then he was gone, leaving her standing in a room that suddenly felt too small for the air in her lungs. The next day, a black car was waiting outside her apartment building. She almost didn't get in, almost called a friend, almost turned back inside, but the driver simply said, Mr. Choi would like a word. And something in his tone told her this wasn't really a request. The ride was silent until they reached a quiet restaurant tucked behind a nondescript door in Gangnam, the kind of place with no sign, no menu, no waiting list, because it didn't need one. Tae-yoon was already seated, a glass of untouched wine in front of him, jacket discarded over the back of his chair like he'd been waiting longer than he wanted to admit. I don't scare easily, Nyla said, sliding into the seat across from him before he could speak first. So if this is supposed to be intimidating, it's dinner, he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not an interrogation. You had me followed. I had you invited. Same thing with better manners. The first time, he laughed low, startled, like the sound had escaped before he could stop it. It transformed his face entirely, stripped away the danger for one unguarded second, and Nyla felt something dangerous of her own stir in her chest. They talked. Not about crates or manifests or the empire he clearly ruled with a closed fist, but about small things, the food neither of them finished, the rain still tapping the windows, the loneliness of building a life in a city that never stopped moving. He was sharper than she expected, funnier than she wanted him to be, and beneath the granite exterior she began to sense something else entirely, a man carrying more weight than his shoulders should have to bear. "Why does everyone fear you?" she finally asked. His jaw tightened. "Because fear keeps people I care about alive." She didn't understand what he meant. Not yet a few days later, flowers began arriving at her office. No card, no explanation, just white orchids that made her coworkers whisper and her supervisor go pale every time a new bouquet appeared. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she wasn't checking her phone for his number, which she didn't even have. Then he simply started appearing. Outside her building at the end of long shifts, leaning against a black car like he had nowhere else in the world he'd rather be. At the small market where she bought groceries, somehow always browsing the same aisle, she should have been unsettled. Instead, her heart did something embarrassing every time she spotted him. "Stalking me," she accused one evening, arms crossed, groceries forgotten at her feet. "I'm protecting you," he corrected, taking the bags from her hands before she could argue. "There's a difference." "Protecting me from what?" His expression darkened just slightly. "From people who would use you to hurt me." Warning in his voice made her stomach twist, not with fear of him, but fear of what orbited him. She was beginning to understand that whatever this was between them, it wasn't simple. It never would be that weekend. He took her to a rooftop garden overlooking the Han River, string lights strung between old trees, the kind of quiet beauty that felt stolen from the chaos of his world. He was different up there, softer, sleeves rolled up, laughter easier, hands finding excuses to brush against hers. "Tell me something true," she said, watching the city lights blur against the dark water. "Something you don't tell anyone." He was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't choose this life. My father built it, and when he died, it became mine to protect or lose. Everyone who works for me, everyone who depends on me, if I show weakness, they die. So I don't. I can't." His eyes found hers, and for once they weren't guarded. "Until you," her breath caught. "You make me want things I stopped allowing myself to want," he admitted, voice rough. "That terrifies me more than any rival ever could." She should have pulled away. Instead, she stepped closer, drawn by a gravity she no longer had the strength to resist. "I'm not asking you to be soft," she whispered. "I'm asking you to be honest." "With you," he said, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face, fingers lingering against her cheek. "I don't know how to be anything else." Air between them turned electric, charged with everything neither of them had said aloud. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't gentle. It was hunger held back for weeks, finally breaking loose, his hand sliding to the small of her back to pull her flush against him like he'd been starving for this exact moment. She melted into him, fingers curling into his shirt, every rational thought dissolving beneath the intensity of his mouth against hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, his forehead rested against hers. "This is dangerous," she whispered. "I know," he murmured. "I don't care anymore." By the following week, whispers began circulating through the city's underworld, rumors of a rival syndicate, the Kang family growing bold enough to test Tae-yoon's territory. And worse, rumors of a woman close to him, a weakness they intended to exploit. At a gala thrown to smooth over business alliances, Nyla stood at Tae-yoon's side in a deep emerald gown, painfully aware of every eye in the room. A man approached her before Tae-yoon could intervene, smooth-talking, too familiar, his hand lingering too long on her arm as he introduced himself as Kang Do-hyun, heir to the rival family. "Lovelier than the rumors suggested," he said, voice silk over something colder. "Choi doesn't deserve someone like you." "Don't recall asking your opinion," Nyla replied evenly, stepping back from his touch. Do-hyun's smile sharpened. "Careful, men like Tae-yoon don't keep things. They use them until they break." Before she could respond, a hand settled possessively at her lower back. Tae-yoon, materializing like smoke, his expression pleasant for the room but his eyes promising violence. "Do-hyun," he said coolly, "you're touching something that belongs to me." "She's a person, not a possession," Do-hyun said, though his eyes flicked warily between them. "She's a person I would burn this city down for," Tae-yoon replied, voice low and lethal. "Remember that the next time you consider touching her again." Threat hung in the air, and Nyla felt it settle into her bones, not fear this time, but something far more consuming. That night after the gala, tension followed them back to Tae-yoon's penthouse like a living thing. Nyla paced near the window, still shaken by Do-hyun's words, by the casual cruelty of a world that treated her like currency to be threatened. Tae-yoon watched her from across the room, jaw tight, hands flexed at his sides like he was fighting the urge to fix something with violence. "You didn't have to claim me like that," she said finally, turning to face him. "Like I'm something you own." "I didn't mean it that way." "Then how did you mean it?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his gaze. "I meant that I would tear apart anyone who tries to hurt you. I meant that since the night I met you, nothing in my life has mattered more than keeping you safe. If that sounded like ownership, it's because I don't know how else to say I'm terrified of losing you." Confession knocked the breath from her lungs. "Tae-yoon, I've buried people I loved," he said, voice cracking with a rawness she'd never heard from him. "My father, my younger brother, every person who ever mattered to me in this life I lost to the world I inherited. I don't know how to love someone without also preparing to lose them. But you," he reached for her hand, pressing it flat against his chest where his heart pounded fast and unsteady. "You make me want to try anyway." Her eyes burned. "I'm scared too," she whispered. "Of this. Of you, of how much I already feel." "Then be scared with me," he said. "Just don't leave." The last of her resistance crumbled. She rose onto her toes and kissed him first this time, slow and certain, and he responded like a man finally allowed to breathe. His hands framed her face with a tenderness that contradicted everything the world believed about him. And when he lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward the bedroom, the only sound was the soft rain returning against the windows and the unspoken vow passing between them, that whatever came next, they would face it together. The city lights dimmed beyond the glass. The rest of the night belonged only to them, wrapped in warmth and whispered promises, every touch a question answered, every breath a confession neither had the words for. By the time dawn crept over Seoul, something between them had shifted permanently. No longer 2 people circling danger, but 2 hearts bound by something neither fully understood yet couldn't deny the next morning. Nyla woke to sunlight and an empty side of the bed, panic rising before she heard Tae-yoon's voice in the next room, low and urgent, speaking rapid Korean into his phone. She caught fragments: Kang, warehouse, find her before they do, and her stomach turned cold. When he entered the bedroom, his expression had transformed entirely, the tenderness from hours before replaced by something hard and calculating. "I have to go," he said. "Business." "What kind of business?" "The kind you shouldn't ask about." Wall between them slammed back into place so fast it left her reeling. Doubt crept in, ugly and familiar, the same fear that had haunted her since childhood, the fear that intimacy always preceded abandonment, that giving herself fully to someone only guaranteed she'd be discarded once the need passed. "Last night meant something to me," she said quietly. "Did it mean anything to you, or was I just—" "Don't." His voice sharpened. "Don't finish that sentence. Then talk to me." "Can't, not right now. Every minute I spend explaining is a minute I'm not protecting you." He grabbed his jacket, moving toward the door with the urgency of a man bracing for war. "Stay here. Don't leave the penthouse. Please." The word please, soft, almost desperate, was the only thing that kept her from unraveling completely. But the moment the door closed behind him, old wounds reopened. She'd given him everything last night, and now she sat alone in an unfamiliar apartment, uncertain if she was cherished or simply convenient. By midday, unable to bear the silence, she left that afternoon. She wandered the streets near the harbor, phone off, trying to outrun the spiral of her own thoughts. She didn't notice the car following at a careful distance until it was too late, didn't register the danger until 2 men stepped into her path outside a quiet alley, expressions void of the charm Do-hyun had worn at the gala. "Ms. Adeyemi," one of them said, using her surname like a threat. Kang Do-hyun would like a word. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She turned to run, but a hand closed around her arm, yanking her back with brutal efficiency. She fought, nails raking across a wrist, a scream rising in her throat before a cloth pressed over her mouth silenced everything into darkness hours later. Tae-yoon returned to the penthouse to find it empty, Nyla's phone dead on the counter, her coat missing from the hook by the door. Cold dread flooded through him faster than any bullet ever had. He tore through the apartment calling her name, already knowing, already understanding with sickening clarity what silence meant in his world. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered before the first ring finished. "Looking for something, Tae-yoon?" Do-hyun's voice, smug and lethal. "Where is she?" It wasn't a question, it was a promise of violence. "Safe, for now. Depends how reasonable you're willing to be about the shipping routes you've been blocking me from." A pause, deliberate and cruel. She's lovely, by the way. I understand the appeal. Something inside Tae-yoon went utterly still, the calm before catastrophic violence. If you touch one hair on her head, he said, voice dropping to something barely human, I will burn every warehouse, every asset, every person wearing your family's name to the ground. I will not stop. There will be nowhere on this earth you can hide. 24 hours, Do-hyun said, or I stop being polite. The line went dead. Tae-yoon's hands shook not with fear, but with a rage so complete it felt like clarity. He called his second in command, voice steady despite the storm inside him. Gather everyone. We're going to war. That evening, Nyla woke in a dim room, wrists bound, head throbbing from whatever they'd used to knock her out. Fear coiled through her, but beneath it burned something sturdier, the same defiance that had first caught Tae-yoon's attention in a rain-soaked office weeks ago. She would not break quietly. Footsteps approached. Do-hyun entered, expression almost gentle, which somehow made him more terrifying. I apologize for the theatrics, he said, crouching to her eye level. This isn't personal, it's business. Tae-yoon has cost my family a great deal. You're simply leverage. He'll kill you for this. He'll try. Do-hyun's smile didn't reach his eyes. Men like him always think love makes them powerful. It only makes them predictable. You're wrong, Nyla said, voice steadier than she felt. Love doesn't make him predictable. It makes him unstoppable. You have no idea what you've started. Something flickered across Do-hyun's face, the first crack in his composure, a flash of uncertainty quickly smoothed over. He rose, straightening his jacket. We'll see how unstoppable he is when he's negotiating for your life instead of fighting for his territory. He left without another word, the door locking with a heavy, final click. Alone in the dark, Nyla closed her eyes, and instead of despair, she found herself replaying the rooftop garden, the confession by the window, the warmth of his arms the night before. He's coming, she told herself. He promised. Hold on. Meanwhile, across the city, Tae-yoon stood in the center of his command room, a war map of Do-hyun's known properties spread before him, his most trusted men awaiting orders. Gone was any trace of the tender man from the rooftop. In his place stood the version of him that had built an empire from nothing, that everyone in Seoul's underworld feared for good reason. Every warehouse, he said, voice cold and final. Every safe house, every person who has ever worked for the Kang family, I want them found by midnight. If negotiations fail, his second asked carefully. Tae-yoon's eyes were dark, unblinking. There will be no negotiations, only recovery. He picked up his jacket, the same one Nyla had straightened for him with careful hands just days before, and something in his chest tightened like a fist closing around glass. I made her a promise, he said quietly. I intend to keep it, even if I have to bury this entire city to do it. Men filed out to prepare, and for one unguarded moment, Tae-yoon allowed himself to feel the full weight of his fear, not for himself, never for himself, but for the woman who had cracked open a heart he'd spent years sealing shut. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. Hold on, Nyla. I'm coming. By midnight, Tae-yoon's men had located the warehouse, an abandoned shipping facility near the docks, exactly the kind of place Do-hyun would choose for its isolation and its symbolism, since it sat on land the Kang family once owned before losing it to Tae-yoon's father years ago. Rain began falling again, steady and cold, as black cars rolled to a silent stop 3 blocks away. No mistakes, Tae-yoon told his men, checking the weapon at his side with hands that had gone perfectly steady now that action had replaced waiting. She comes out of there unharmed. That's the only outcome I'll accept. They moved through the shadows like smoke, disabling the outer guards with brutal efficiency. Tae-yoon led from the front, every step fueled by a fear he refused to let slow him down. When they breached the main floor, gunfire erupted sharp, chaotic, the world narrowing to survival and purpose. He fought through it without hesitation, each obstacle just another second between him and the room where they were holding her. He found her tied to a chair in a windowless room, exhausted but unbroken, chin lifted with the same defiance that had first captured him. Relief crashed through him so violently his knees nearly buckled. Tae-yoon, she breathed, voice cracking. He crossed the room in seconds, cutting her bindings, pulling her into his arms like he needed to feel her heartbeat against his own to believe she was real. I'm here, he murmured into her hair, voice rough with everything he'd held back for hours. I'm here, I've got you. I knew you'd come, she whispered, clinging to him. Always, he vowed. Every time, for the rest of our lives. Outside, Do-hyun attempted to flee through a service exit, only to find Tae-yoon's second-in-command waiting, flanked by enough men to end any thought of resistance. When Tae-yoon emerged with Nyla safely behind him, wrapped in his jacket, Do-hyun's composure finally shattered. "This isn't over," Do-hyun spat, even as he was forced to his knees. "It is for you," Tae-yoon said quietly, and something in his tone carried more finality than any shouted threat could. "You touched what's mine. In this city, that's the one mistake that has no forgiveness." He turned away, dismissing him entirely, his only remaining concern the woman trembling against his side. "Take him to answer for this through proper channels. I won't waste another second of tonight on him." Authorities, the ones who owed Tae-yoon quiet favors for years of careful diplomacy, arrived to handle what remained. The Kang family's operations dismantled within days as rivals and allies alike recognized the cost of crossing him. But none of that mattered to Tae-yoon in that moment. Only Nyla mattered, her hand tight in his as they walked away from the warehouse and toward whatever came next day, week later. Once the chaos had settled, and Seoul's underworld had recalibrated around the reminder of exactly what Choi Tae-yoon was capable of, he took Nyla back to the rooftop garden overlooking the Han River. The same string lights, the same quiet water, though everything between them felt different now, deepened by fire they'd walked through together. "Have to tell you something," he said, turning to face her fully, his usual composure replaced by something achingly vulnerable. "That night you disappeared, I understood something I'd been avoiding my entire life. I don't just want to protect you. I want to build something with you. A life that isn't just about survival, but about us." He reached into his jacket, producing a small velvet box, and Nyla's breath caught entirely. "Know this life is dangerous," he continued, voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him. "I know loving me means accepting a world most people would run from, but I promise you every single day I will choose you first. Before the empire, before the danger, before anything. Nyla Adeyemi, will you marry me?" Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to find words strong enough for the moment, finally whispering, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and when he kissed her, it tasted like relief, like promise, like every fear finally settling into peace months later. Their wedding took place beneath the same string lights on that same rooftop. A small gathering of the people who mattered most. Nyla's mother flown in from Lagos to see her daughter marry a man who looked at her like she was the only steady thing in an unsteady world. Tae-yoon, dressed in quiet black rather than the sharp suits of his business dealings, had never looked less like a mafia boss and more like a man simply, completely in love. "Promise to protect you," he vowed during the ceremony, voice thick with emotion. "Not because you're weak, but because you're the only thing in this world I couldn't survive losing." "I promise to stay," Nyla answered. "Not because I'm afraid to leave, but because there's nowhere else I'd rather be." A year later, Seoul's skyline glittered beyond the windows of a penthouse that finally felt like a home rather than a fortress. Nyla stood by the window, one hand resting against the gentle curve of her stomach, watching the city lights she'd once found so intimidating now feel entirely her own. Tae-yoon came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, resting his hand over hers. "Any kicks yet?" "A few," she laughed softly. "I think she's going to be as stubborn as her father." "Or as fearless as her mother," he murmured against her temple, and the love in his voice held none of the danger that once defined him. Only warmth, only devotion, only the quiet certainty of a man who had finally found the one thing worth building a peaceful life around. Outside, Seoul carried on, unaware that somewhere above its chaos, a mafia boss who once ruled through fear had traded his armor for something far stronger, love that had survived danger, doubt, and everything the world tried to use against it. And in that quiet room, wrapped in each other, Nyla and Tae-yoon understood that whatever came next, they would face it exactly as they'd promised. Together, unshaken and unafraid.